went down. But first, Sean Spicer, the communications director and chief strategist for the Republican National Committee. Sean, good to see you this morning.
Brian.
Let's get into the debate in just a moment. But right now, there's a debate playing out here on Sunday Morning TV between two of the leading candidates for your party's nomination, Donald Trump and Jeb Bush. And amazingly, it's over the topic of 9/11. Here's what we heard this morning from Jeb Bush and Donald Trump on the Sunday morning shows.
Does anybody actually blame my brother for the attacks on 9/11? If they do, they're totally marginalized in our society.
I'm not blaming George Bush, but I don't want Jeb Bush to say my brother kept us safe, because September 11th was one of the worst days in the history of this country.
14 years after that terrible day. Sean, did you ever imagine the RNC would be having this intra-party debate about the attacks?
No, I think, look, you know where I come down, Brian. I think myself and Chairman Reince Priebus want these candidates talking positively about where they want to take this country, why we have a better vision than the Democrats, and to stop litigating necessarily the past and each other and focus on what they will do as individuals, as Republicans, to make this country
So you're
better.
agreeing this is not what the RNC had in mind heading into the fall of 2015?
Well, I would say that this is one little spat, right? But I think all of them, there's been several, and I think on both sides of the aisle, but in particular on the Republican side, we at the party believe it is much more helpful, much more beneficial in the long run if we're actually focusing on why we're better, why our candidates are better.
Does the party have any point of view on whether Trump or Bush are in the right here about whether former President George W. Bush should be given any blame for the people that died that day?
I think George Bush did a great job keeping America safe. There's no question about that. We had a horrific
attack. Do you mean
attack
after 9/11? Do you mean starting on 9/12?
Excuse me?
Do you mean starting on 9/12?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question. When this country was attacked, George Bush did everything he could to keep the country safe going forward. I think it is a bit, I don't believe Donald Trump, and you saw that comment earlier this morning that he made on another network, where he's not blaming him for 9/11. And I think that we can all agree that President Bush, regardless if you're Republican or Democrat, did everything to do to protect this country before 9/11 and definitely after 9/11.
We talked on this program over the summer about some of the warfare we've seen within the GOP. You called for, quote, no more name calling. Do you feel that's been ignored in recent weeks, especially involving Trump?
A lot of them, actually. It hasn't been completely followed, but it doesn't mean we're not going to keep pushing for it.
So you're reiterating that this morning?
Excuse me?
You're reiterating that this morning?
And I think Chairman Priebus, when he talks to every one of those candidates on a regular basis, does the same. And he says, I get what you're trying to do, but here's what I think would be more helpful. Look, they're going to run their own campaigns. We get that. But our job is to try to do what's best for the party as a whole, to try to make sure that we put ourselves in the best possible position to win next November.
That's what brings us to the next GOP debate on CNBC. Right. Take us behind the scenes a bit. These normally private negotiations about how long a debate's going to be and what the format's going to be spilled out into public view this week. What was the ultimate conclusion about the GNBC debate?
Right. Well, look, and you framed it perfectly. Every single one of these debates takes about 5 years off my life in terms of the negotiation. But they are just that. There's a back and forth where the RNC advocates for things that the candidates want and tries to work with the network to collectively take care of that. That was definitely the case this time. It's a back and forth between the networks and the candidates. CNBC has been committed to having a really, really great debate, and they had some tweaks that they wanted to implement that they've always done in the past. The candidates felt it was important to have an opportunity both at the beginning and the end of the debate to express who they were and why they were running. We agreed with them, and we worked with CNBC back and forth on behalf of the candidates, and we came to an agreement on something that I think is very helpful for them. With respect to the timing, when CNBC announced this debate in September 28th, they said very explicitly at the time that it would be a 2-hour debate.
Right.
What the debate about that was there was a question whether that 2 hours would or would not include commercial breaks. Several of the candidates felt like the last debate had gone on too long, and so they wanted to ensure that it was 2 hours of total time. And we were ultimately able to work with CNBC to get that as well. So I feel very good about how the RNC handled this on behalf of the candidates. And ultimately, we're going to have a great debate on CNBC.
You mentioned the last debate. It was on CNN for the GOP. It was 3 hours long. What's remarkable is that viewers, almost all of them, stayed for the whole debate. Isn't it good for viewers, good for voters to have longer debates, not shorter debates?
Well, I think it's a formula, right? Because it's not just a question of timing. It's how many candidates are on stage, where you are. In the case of the Reagan Library, it's what people don't see necessarily off off camera is that the room was rather hot. The candidates it was late in the evening. Remember, it was a West Coast debate, so if you were from the East Coast, which most of them are, it's not just, you can't just say this is the time that makes sense. Each debate has to get negotiated in itself.
There's a balancing act you're saying here between the interests of all the people involved. Last question for you. I've heard some complaints from candidates that aren't polling as well that you all should be using, and CNBC in particular should be using early state polls, not just national polls. Tell us why national polls are the determining factor for who's on the main stage for the next debate.
That's actually a really good question, Brian. And there's a couple reasons. Number one, there's very few consistent early state polls. So when you look at Iowa, for example, there's only been 3 that have been done since the debate at CNN, and they're not consistent, so that you've got maybe 2 in New Hampshire, 1 in South Carolina. And one of the things that's really interesting about a lot of these candidates who want early state polling in is they don't want early state polling in, they want specific early state polling. So someone might say, I want Iowa included, or I think only Iowa and New Hampshire, or I want just South Carolina, or South Carolina and New Hampshire. But if you want just early state polling, which would be the 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, that yields a different scenario that's very close to where we are now. So it's when the candidates talk about including early state polling, they're not necessarily saying we want all early state polling. They are only saying they want early state polling that generally benefits them.
What a fascinating job you have to see how, as with everything the past 4 months, this campaign is not following the rules. New rules are being created by Trump and the others, and in this case, private negotiations going public is the latest example. Sean, thanks for being here this morning.
You bet, Brian.